Hello everyone and welcome. My name is James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. Those of you who've come here to our newsroom for the first time, welcome here to the newsroom at Tortoise. We hope that we are keeping everyone sufficiently distanced that you feel kind of comfortable enough with it. For everyone who's joining us online via Zoom, thank you for joining us too. We'll make sure that we hear from you in the course of this conversation. And a big welcome to Ed Balls. Thank you, Ed, for joining us today.
Thank you.
The nature of a think-in is that it's essentially like an editorial news meeting where, as far as is humanly possible, we actually all have a conversation. So it shouldn't be one of those events where it's a kind of two-way between me and Ed for the course of the hour. Where you've got anything that you want to say it. We have a loosely enforced rule and a think-in, which is no questions. We want to hear what you think. But as you may notice, the powers of enforcement here are pretty weak. So, just do what you think is best to do. And we're going to try and pull off an unlikely trick, which is that on the day that Keir Starmer made his first speech to a live Labour conference, and as the fuel pumps are sputtering and the arguments about Brexit are reviving, we're going to try to do what Ed pulls off in this book, which is not only this extraordinary haircut and terrific shirt on the front cover. What he pulls off in this book is an attempt to do a memoir through food, an examination of things that he's loved in cookery, but also the experiences he's had of food. And so, Ed, the reason why I think we might get away with it. I can
feel you're slightly uncomfortable about this test.
No, because I tell you what I thought to myself was like, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do the segue from the Yorkshire puddings to the, future of Labour? But actually it happens quite easily within the book. There's one thing that I never knew that comes up in the memoir section. So the way the book works is you get recipes, and then after each recipe you get a chapter about a period of your life. And about halfway through the book, there's this wonderful section on food and politics, in which you make this great point that no one who's gone to a significant political meeting over a lunch or a dinner can remember what they ate. Yep. And you describe, which I never realised, that you went to the Granita dinner. Now, there may be some people here who are too young to remember what the Granita dinner was, so you may have to explain that.
Okay.
But just tell us a little bit about whether you can actually remember. I think you may have had the starter. What that dinner was like and what it meant.
Well, it's kind of nostalgic for me to come to my first ever Tortoise think-in, this sort of newsroom editorial conference environment, because 4 years before Granita, I'd had my first ever job, and that was as the young leader writer at the Financial Times, and I was 23, and it was the week that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and I arrived and spent 4 years in this sort of rarefied atmosphere. The Financial Times had a debate a month into my arrival as to whether they should abolish leaders' editorials, which would have been a blow, but luckily decided not to. So that was okay. And so I had 4 years, and then I moved over to work for Gordon Brown. I'd been for a year before the Granita dinner. I'd been travelling down very regularly to see Gordon since just after Black Wednesday in 1992. I first knew about it when the editor of the Financial Times, Richard Lambert, took me aside and said, "You're about to get a call from Gordon Brown's office asking whether you'd like to go and work for him." It's slightly odd that your employer would tell you this. But I quite like my FT job, so I would go down every morning, most mornings, and talk to Gordon about why the ERM was a mistake, how Labour should be rebuild its economic credibility, talking about lots of different things. And finally, I resigned from the FT when they wouldn't let me go to Africa to join Gordon. And just like a few weeks later, John Smith died. I was with him at 1 a.m. at a big fundraiser. He kind of gave me this big John Smith bear hug and said, "We've got to get the thinkers together, Ed." And then at 8 a.m, we found out he passed away, plunged Labour into this sort of big convulsion. And the Granita's dinner was at the end of that process, because everybody had thought that Gordon, certainly Gordon thought that Gordon was the natural successor. And I think if you went back a few years, that was the general view. And Tony Blair had sort of emerged post the 92 election in particular. And from the beginning, when John Smith died, Tony Blair was ahead in the polls, and lots of people, senior people, came around him, and it had been kind of accepted that Gordon was, was going to need to defer to Tony, and I think he knew that from the beginning, but thought quite hard about it. And then it was arranged there was to be this dinner at Granita's, and the history books remember the Granita's dinner as the night of the deal.
Yeah.
And the deal, which is sort of written about, the BBC made a big TV programme about, was whether Tony Blair agreed that if Gordon stood aside for him, that Tony would at some future point stand down as Prime Minister and support Gordon to succeed. And I've never been convinced at all that that was the deal which happened that day. I've always believed that Tony will have said during the dinner, "Of course I won't go on forever, Gordon, and you're the natural person to come after me." And Gordon will have remembered that. But actually, Gordon went in to seek an agreement about partnership. This was to be, that the agreement was he would have he would have control over economic and social policy within the Tony Blair shadow cabinet, and there would be joint discussions of policy and appointments and all the things which ended up causing great kind of grief from 1997 onwards. But that was the deal that they struck. And the next morning, they did a walk through the New Palace Yard outside Parliament for the cameras, and the briefing was that Tony Blair has agreed that Gordon Brown will be coordinator of economic and social policy. So, but the nature of politics was, where do you have the final meeting to kind of bless this moment? And it was Tony's idea, and he said that he wanted it to happen in this shishi Mediterranean restaurant on Upper Street called Granita, which I think actually in Spanish means like kind of ice, fruity ice. Actually, right. I'm not sure if I know. And Gordon definitely didn't. And it was supposed to be the two of them. But Gordon was not totally convinced he really wanted to be there at all, especially in this shishi Mediterranean restaurant. And I lived at the time in Dalston, which was quite close by. And he said, would I go with him? And so I turned up. And then the three of us sat down together, Tony, Gordon and me. And the first thing Gordon did was he turned to me with a menu and said, "What exactly is polenta?" Tony Blair almost certainly ordered baby octopus. Gordon didn't, and I have no idea what he ate. They did order their starters and mains with the three of us. I was feeling like this kind of such a bursting kind of gooseberry. Tony kept looking at me like, "Why are you here?" And I don't really know. And in the end, I sort of stood up and said, "I need to get back to the office." and then left, but to give you kind of Gordon Brown inside view of I went back down to 4 Millbank where there was a restaurant called the Atrium, met with Sunai and Charlie Whelan, and an hour and a half later we had a call from Gordon on our mobile to say, "Order me steak and chips," and so we all went and ate dinner in the Atrium, and Gordon had a full meal, so he obviously hadn't committed to the Granita experience. And the reason why it became public, I was actually just thinking about this as I was doing the book talking about it, was that there was the future Prime Minister and Chancellor, the leader of the opposition, the Shadow Chancellor, and they thought that if they went into the back of an Islington restaurant, they could not be noticed. And that's and they were actually quite annoyed when this then appeared in the newspapers. And the reason why it appeared in the newspapers was because Alison Phillips, who's now a Telegraph columnist, who at the time was the Standard Diary, as I got up to leave, went, "Hi, Ed," and then looked over and said, "Hi, Tony." And that was the moment, and therefore that's how the Granita deal story was written. But what were they thinking? These days it would have been, on Instagram or Twitter as they walked into the restaurant, but they genuinely thought they could do a whole meal and not get noticed. But I think the interesting thing is that it was done over food. If Gordon couldn't be summoned to Tony's room without that being too hierarchical and power exactly. On the other hand, although food at a restaurant was sort of softer, it was Tony's choice of restaurant in Islington. So Gordon's kind of went to him, but the food had a sort of, kind of supper. I'm not going to say Last Supper, but a sort of a kind of a significance to it. A sort of, this was a breaking of bread, if you like, and I think often in politics, food plays that sort of role of being the thing over which important things happen, whether it's in the G7 meeting or lots of different places. But it's almost always not about the food, as you said.
But there's something interesting, because in the book, one of the things that is really amazing is like how much you remember exactly what you ate and when, right? So you just...
I was quite unusual. I mean, I actually thought the food was quite a big deal. And I liked the food. This was almost nobody actually. The only person who I can ever say truly cared about the food, this actually isn't in this book, but is we'd gone to a meeting of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, and Gordon was in the chair. All the finance ministers of the world really represented 24 constituencies. I was in the British seat, sitting next to the French finance minister, later to become the president, Nicolas Sarkozy. And there was this whole conversation going on about representation of emerging markets in the IMF, which Gordon was trying to manage, and the Americans were being quite heavy, and the Brazilians were quite heavy. And at a certain point, Sarkozy turned to me and went, "This is ridiculous." This is ridiculous. He said it was in a French accent. I can't do the French accent. I'm not going to try. It's ridiculous. And I turned to him and said, "What do you mean, Nicholas?" Thinking he was talking about, Brazilian quotas. And he said, "Do they expect us to eat this?" He said, pointing at his plate, which was quite a well-done steak. And he was the only person who clearly cared more about the food than reform of the International Monetary Fund.
But so you're in the book, we get you're starting going out with Yvette. You have the fish and chips. She takes you for a sushi restaurant. We get all of the moments of food. But the thing you say
actually famous. I mean, kind of most importantly, the chicken curry our mum made for me.
Yes, that's right. It's a major event.
Which we go down, and Yvette says, "My mum's making a chicken curry," and I thought, well, that's really nice of her. But we're going to see. I'm meeting Yvette's mum for the first time, and Yvette said, "I don't think you realise what a big deal this is." Mm. And it turned out that Yvette's mum had given up all cooking 2 years before, when her youngest child left home on the grounds that after 21 years, that was enough, and her dad was to take over. So she came out of retirement to cook for me. And but as it says in the book, Yvette retired on the day our first child was born. I mean, I should have seen the writing on the wall. What was going on? Yvette's mum waited 21 years. Yvette didn't wait a day.
Well, I'm going to make a very awkward segue, because I remember having at party conferences, and Emily Benn, my colleague, is just back from 3 days, may feel longer than that, Emily, at Labour Party conference in Brighton. At those party conferences, there's a kind of ritual around food, and you've slightly sort of punctured it for me, because I remember you'd always go and you'd have lunch with a cabinet minister here and a cabinet minister there. And one of the things in the book is clear is that actually politicians have no idea what they're eating at any time. I remember at a Conservative Party conference, we took Ken Clarke to some relatively fancy place, and he scooped up with his fork this piled fork of wasabi, right, that was there, and this was Birmingham that year, and he just hoofed it in, and then you just saw him just redden. And Ken Clarke's quite red to begin with, and he was red, and he said, "Oh, what's that?" He said, "It's wasabi." He goes, "Oh, I thought it was mushy peas." But this is my segue into...
But before you do, you know in opposition how important you are, or how close you are to power, on the basis of how many invites you get from what level. Right. So if the editors come down, that's like really good news. And if they all come down, and of course it's all about face and amor propria, and you can't offend people by not doing it. So in that period, to be fair, after Tony Blair became leader, after we were heading the polls, we were absolutely the total kind of flavour in 95 and 96 and the run up to the 97 election. And everybody came, and every editor wanted their moment. And so during that period, we would have, Gordon Brown, me, we'd have 2 dinners a night and 2 lunches a day. And because it was the only way to get everybody in. And you had to arrive knowing that you had to go through the whole ritual again 2.5 hours later. You'd go, somebody at 7 and then somebody else at 9:30. And if you were disciplined, then you would have something light and fishy. But if you're Gordon, Gordon's food range was sufficiently narrow. If it was French, he was having steak and chips. And if it was Chinese, he was having lemon chicken. If it was Italian, he was having spaghetti bolognese. And basically, if you went to 2 Italian restaurants, he had spaghetti bolognese twice. And that was just sort of how, we used to, again, nobody gave a toss what the food was. Nobody cared what the restaurants were. The important thing
was who you had.
Who was coming and showing respect. And if you were to arrive and say, actually, I think we won't have a starter. The editor of the Times at the time would have thought, well,
yes,
am I not worthy of a starter? So you had to go through the whole deal twice.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Well, the thing about it is it comes. The thing about
your credibility really depended upon
how much you would actually eat. Well, I think that, to be fair, my experience was people really eat.
They ate a lot.
You make the point about the curry house plot in Wolverhampton that no one can remember what they actually ate. Food comes across in this book as being extremely important to everyone except politicians and entirely functional to politicians. And I wonder what that makes you think about politicians and the way they kind of see the things that are important to all the rest of us.
Well, you're right about functionality.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to plot and you plot having a meeting, it's a plot.
Yeah.
Whereas if you order a gathering of like-minded people in a West Midlands curry house, you're just going out for a curry. And so the one you refer to was the Tom Watson 2006 Tony Blair plot curry, and none of them will have any idea what they ate.
Yeah.
But that was why it was happening, but it was done in a curry house. The problem was that what then happened over time was people cottoned onto the idea that if you were plotting, it was likely to happen over food. So as a consequence, anytime you ever had a group of people eating food,
it was yes,
must be a plot.
That's right, the Nando's conspiracy.
And Yvette and I got into real trouble with Ed Miliband in about 2012. We'd had all of my team and Yvette's team round to our house for, it was lasagna, recipes in the book, about 35 people. And by the weekend, it was Ed and Yvette's lasagna plot.
Yes, the lasagna
because
plot.
If we were having MPs round with a lasagna, must be a coup. And then, of course, when there wasn't a coup, they all said they were incompetent.
So, Ed, all right, now I'm going to try and pursue my segue to party conference.
I know, I'm still talking about appetite and food.
Appetite, food. We'll come back to lots of food, and lots of people have views on food, and they'll have views, no doubt, on dancing, and they'll have views on good piano, a fair few things. But I suppose, when we set up Tortoise, I remember calling you, because I think that part of the frustration I'd had in the news, at the Times, at the BBC, was these big trends that were happening, and neither the politics nor the media seemed to be getting close. And the biggest was a version, Kerry Thomas, my colleague here, would say it would be the power gap. We'd talk about inequality in some form or other, and the failure of politics to deal with that. And I wonder now that you've got a bit of distance, you can watch what unfolds in Labour Party conference, but if you just take that as the problem, what do you think governments, if anything, can really do about the growing inequality, about the growing power gap in the country?
Well, I think you have. There were certain moments which do change the direction, and we've just had a national insurance rise for social care, which is happening at the time the government's cutting universal credit. When we raised national insurance for the health service in 2001, we did that at a time when we were increasing tax credits, which I think made it politically easier to pull off. But I think that in terms of public services and tackling inequality, it was a totally pivotal moment, because by the time you got to 2010, David Cameron fought the election on cut the deficit and not the NHS.
Yeah.
In 2001, I remember having kind of fearsome breakfasts and lunches at the Times, where we were being told the health service is a failed model. You will have to move to private insurance, to some form of social insurance model. There'll have to be kind of top-up fees, and the Tories fought that election in 2005, the national insurance tax rise ended up being galvanizingly popular to such an extent it wasn't mentioned in the election campaign, and the NHS had become the cross-party symbol of health delivery. In 1997, when we won the election, the national minimum wage, hugely controversial, opposed by the Conservatives. By the time we got to George Osborne, boasting about raising the national minimum wage had become part of his politics. This universal credit debate, I think, is quite interesting. If you remember back in the autumn of 2015, when George tried to follow through with the cuts to tax credits, and he was defeated in Parliament by a revolt led by Lord Lawson, who said that this was unfair. And I think that sometimes you have moments which solidify and become part of the consensus. In a way, the consensual things, by the time they come consensual, they aren't always the things which are controversial. But your big achievement in politics is to turn the contentious into the consensual. And there have been things which have happened over the last 25 years which have become cross-party consensual. And those are successes. So I don't think it's true to say that politics always fails to tackle inequality, or that it can't be done. But and often things are divisive at the time, and it's when it's become the common parlance of the day that you're succeeding.
That's not what I'm saying. And by the way, please do weigh in. So we've done a fair bit of chat about food, but actually this subject is probably the one that is most difficult for us inside the newsroom when we try and figure it out, because I was involved in a conversation with Kwasi Kwarteng the other day, right, business secretary, who says probably the biggest question that faces politics is how much money should we tax, borrow and spend? Right, that's it's not necessarily the debate that you hear every day. It's not the debate that we heard in the last 3 days inside the Labour Party conference, and it certainly won't be the debate you hear next week in the Conservative Party conference. But it feels as though, Ed, you must have thought for a while about whether or not we're spending enough as a government or spending too much, and looking across particularly the US at what Biden's done and that big package of spending. And whether you think, right, the lesson for the UK is if you really want to level up, if you really want to deal with structural inequalities, if you really want to invest in the next generation of industries, do we need to have another moment where, if you like, the centre of gravity in economic policy shifts? And that's ultimately the debate that we don't really have in our politics. And I wonder what you think of it.
Well, I think in a way, the pandemic has forced a big change in the amount in which we spend and the amount in which we tax. It might also, by the way, have led to some structural changes which will lead to kind of deeper inequalities than would otherwise be the case in education. So it's not inevitably the case that a society which decides to spend more and tax more is also a society which is doing better at inequality. We might be seeing both going in different directions at the moment. However,
just explain that. Why would you necessarily see even greater inequality at the same time as you would see greater public spending?
It depends what you are kind of spending on, and what the distribution and the impact of that spending is. We are, we've gone. During the period when I was Secretary of State for Education, I remember arriving early on and saying, "Why are we right to resist parents who say to afford a holiday, we want to take our children out of school for a week?" And the answer was, the academic evidence is absolutely clear that the loss of a day is bad, and 2 days is bad, and that to lose a week or 10 days is really bad, and that's why we should resist it. And we've just gone through an 18 month where not only has the whole young population lost days and months of educational outcomes, but actually the inequality between those who managed to keep learning through the pandemic and those who have been unable to learn because of their home environment or the lack of being in school, or the nature of technology. I mean, that is, I don't think that, I can't think of any event in my lifetime which will, in the last year and a half, have widened education opportunity, and that's happened over a year and a half, not just one day.
Yeah.
But that's happened during a period where public spending as a share of GDP has been rising and rising, because we've been spending huge amounts of money on furlough and on health. So all I'm just saying is you can have simultaneously, you can look and say, oh, look, our spending and tax share is rising.
And you can have the wider.
We must be tackling inequality. And I'm just pointing out that that's happened contemporaneously with, and maybe in a very related way to, what could turn out to be the education inequality shock of this generation. And what are we going to do about it? Now, I certainly think that we should be doing something big about it, and it's going to cost lots of money. So this is not an argument against public spending or tax. All I'm just saying is that sometimes you can see a rise in spending and taxation, and that isn't caused by or leading to a tackling of inequality. And sometimes it can happen the other way around. I think that's likely to be what we've seen in the last year. Second thing I'm just going to say is that I don't think we should have any confidence that this is like a permanent shift. And I think if you are Labour or Joe Biden and say the public has now signed up to a bigger share of spending and tax in GDP, and that is something which we can now rely upon and build upon, I think politically that would be quite risky. And it comes down
risky for the left?
For the left. Well, I think it would be risky for both sides. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in the Conservative Party. My prediction is there will be a huge row about the level of spending and tax between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor over the next 1 or 2 years, because I think they're going to take quite different views about the size of the state. I think what Labour has to be focused on, if it's going to win, is not simply the level of the size of the state, but what the money's for and whether people believe in its purpose. I think when I think back to the lesson we learned from 1992, I think the biggest problem we had, and don't forget that was at a time when you'd had the longest recession since the Second World War, you'd had a big deficit, but also a rise in spending. And I think the biggest problem we had was people believing that we wouldn't spend money well. That actually, when I think back to what we were saying in the period up to 1997, it's, we aren't the party of the quick fix, the easy option, simply throwing money at vested interests, giving into the short-term pressure. The thing I think Keir has to do is show that where he's got money to spend, he's spending it for a long-term purpose which people can understand, and where he shows he's winning kind of public support and respect for how he'd spend the money. And if it sounds like it's just being, we're a high-spend country now, let's just pile the money out. I think for Labour, I think for both sides, but for Labour, that's very, very risky, because people won't believe in its purpose. I think people are much more focused on quality of spend than they are necessarily on the level of tax.
I get that, but the implication of what you're saying is that ultimately in this country, for the foreseeable future, the Conservatives will set the envelope. They will set the amount that is politically acceptable to tax and spend. Well,
I think to be fair to Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, they've just set out a tax rise for a social purpose, which they didn't have to do. And the last government to do that was us in 2001-2. And these are very unusual moments, because normally when governments raise tax, they're raising tax to make good a problem, to close a gap. And I think what we showed in 2001 is you can go out and say, we should raise taxes to the National Health Service and win the argument. But we didn't win the argument over the fairness of the tax rise. We won it because people decided the money was well spent. And in 2005, they said the NHS is better. And that's why I'm going to keep voting Labour. And I think for Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, the reason they've done this is because they're really worried the NHS is going to deteriorate in the next few years if they don't spend, which is a problem for them. They have to win the argument that they're going to spend this money in a way which will deliver better outcomes. Labour's challenge is to show that actually the Conservatives don't know how to deliver and spend well, fairly and effectively. But if it gets into its mind, the rules of the game have changed. The public's now signed up to these big spending increases. Let's just go for it. I think particularly for a lesser centre party,
they can't.
That's fatal.
And they shouldn't, and they can't or shouldn't do a Biden. They shouldn't go out and say, look, we're going to do a massive infrastructure spend. We're going to do a massive new spend on families. We're going to do a post-COVID health spend. You don't think Labour could or should do that?
I think there are rightly lots of Democrats who are cautious about the Biden strategy. That isn't to say that it's the wrong strategy. I mean, of course, the right thing to do for the US was to, during the pandemic, to support families through it. And because of Trump, it happened late. And of course, if you're tackling climate change and making America fairer, let's be honest, from a lower base in terms of tax and spend, it's the right approach. So I support the Biden direction, but whether people feel that it's been done in a way which has supported the economy, has been well spent, will be a big part of determining whether he wins in the next presidential election. And the assumption that the rules of the game have changed and therefore it's okay, let's just do a Biden. If I was an American politician, I'd be really worried about that assumption, because I think the public would be quite skeptical about that.
Yeah.
The moment you say, let's just spend more, people will think, well, but are we sure it'll deliver? Yeah. And if Labour thinks, let's just do a Biden, I didn't read Rachel Reeves' speech yesterday and think that's what she was saying.
No, I don't.
I think she was trying really hard to talk about value and output and delivery and trust. And of course, that was what we were trying to do when we were in opposition when I was there.
Hold on, Ben, just 1 second. Phoebe's got a hand up, and I'm going to come to you because there's going to pass a mic, otherwise they can't hear you at home. So I'm going to come to Phoebe, and I'm going to come to Ben, and then there's a bunch of people who've made comments. If you do want us to raise your digital hand, please do that too, and I'll make sure to bring you in. Phoebe, you want to go first, yeah?
Hi. So I just thought the stuff you were saying about education was really interesting, and we're talking about tax, is that something I've been thinking about, a couple of us here who are graduates, is the changes to student loans and the repayment threshold that's likely going to happen. If it's not now, when? I wonder, we talk about educational inequality like lower down the line, but the idea of good education, we think, and it's kind of been pushed, is to go to university, and retrospectively, I am being taxed or paying money because I did a soft degree, what would be called a soft degree. I feel like I do quite hard things now, but I just kind of was wondering on your thoughts on that, because I feel like clearly students has become quite a flashpoint, like what we charge students, how much we charge them. But surely to me, I am less value to the economy right now because I've just lost a chunk of my disposable income. It's about a month's rent in London. I'm not going to be spending that money anywhere else because I'm now worried, especially because my national insurance is going up too. I don't really understand how those two ideas mesh at all.
I think it's that if we were to talk about tackling educational opportunity and getting an education offering which will really, as Keir said today, retool our society for the future, we would be worrying more about non-university spend and expanding non-university education. I think it is right that people who get a degree make a contribution to their repayment. I've always much preferred a kind of a graduate tax idea to loans, although we've sort of ended up with a sort of quasi-graduate tax now where people feel kind of burdened by it, and but I'm not sure, I'm pretty out of date on the numbers now, but a sizable minority will never repay their loan throughout their working life. So it's actually kind of operates a bit like a tax anyway. If it was me, I'd be pretty inclined to think that the people on the highest incomes could pay a bit more, and people on low incomes as graduates aren't paying a huge amount back. And if I was thinking about the system, I think I might be focused on the upper end rather than the lower end clawback. But in principle, I don't think that would be my priority for spend, relieving that burden.
Do you think politics is going to get more generational as a result of this?
Yes and no, because I don't disagree with spending, like paying for my degree. I absolutely don't disagree. But I think it's the trust thing, is that, I sat down and I signed up to my degree and it was going to cost this much. And, I understood that and I took on that burden. And they can't, the ability to turn around, because who's to say it's not going to happen again and again and again. And I'm sitting here, and something that's really interesting is that your mortgage repayments aren't impacted by your student loan. My student loan is £59,000. It's very good that doesn't impact if I want to apply to a mortgage, but it does cut a significant amount out of my income. So it does make me worry, like, what if that starts to happen? Like if a company turns around and says, I'm not going to offer you a loan because it's, you're paying this loan at 6% interest at the moment, that's a worry for me in the future. It's not a worry for now, it's a worry for the future.
Thank you. Ben, will you just pass the mic over to Ben? And I'm gonna bring in, if I might, Sally Young and Susie Laxton in a minute, who are just joining us on the screen, Ben.
Hi, thanks, James. What Phoebe was raising there, I think, was an elemental thing, which is fairness. We were talking about fairness. You don't go into a restaurant, Granito or anywhere else, look at the menu, and then when they come to give you the bill, it's gone up by 10%. And so changing the rules of how you repay that for somebody who's already sort of, as you said, calculated whether it's worth it or not, is obviously an unfair thing. I mean, I think it's
if it's seen as a loan.
Yeah.
Which is part of our problem at the moment. Yes, is the government runs a graduate tax and calls it a loan, and that gets into this real mess about. Whereas if you say we're going to increase the income tax rate by a penny, you wouldn't say that was unfair. You would say that was a budget decision.
Yeah, understood. And language is very important. But in general, don't you think? James will tell you I'm a bit party pre. I've published a book on the subject of fairness. Don't you think the left, both here and in America, has kind of somehow lost its natural purchase on the concept of fairness? That Johnson's talking about levelling up. He's kind of almost occupied that area, whereas his predecessor almost wrote the book on unfairness by the way they approached the global financial crisis, which in itself has been one of the greatest acts of unfairness to the vast majority of the world's population in recent history. And it seems to me that until we get a grip, not allowing extremists like Johnson to monopolise the concept of fairness, but having people who've got more centre views, I don't care if they're centre right or centre left, but people who can do what fairness is, which is a consensual, as you said, a consensual process, but importantly a process where we determine what we believe is fair in order to set the boundaries of how we address that. And it strikes me that in politics today, nobody is really going back to that fundamental point. What is fair? What do we mean by fairness? And what do we mean by unfairness? We all just talk about granularities of policy, and the principle itself is left kind of unpinned down.
I think politically, and for a centre-left party or a left party, the word fairness is a complicated word. It's a challenging word, because people can hear that word and hear it in different ways. We have kind of lived through a decade, or through 2 or 3 decades, where incomes of those at the top have grown much faster, and sometimes there's a real unfairness to that. And when you look at whether people pay their fair share of tax, that is unfair. But the voters hear the word fairness from left parties, and they don't always hear what you want them to hear. So in the 1992 shadow budget, John Smith said, the reason I go back to 1992 because I'm thinking of times in the past where Labour, after a long period in opposition, was trying to win back support. John Smith said, my shadow budget is fair. And he said, because only the richest 10% will pay more. And if you look at the polling at the time, probably didn't believe it. public believed they were all going to pay more tax under Labour. And the word fairness, I think was politically quite complicated for Labour at the time. So the reason why.
Depressing thing to hear.
No.
I mean,
Well, I mean, I say it's not my job to make you kind of depressed or not depressed. I'm just telling you what the reality is, And once you've lost lots and lots of elections, as was the case in 1992 or today, you have to sort of hear and understand that. So I think that people are. If you say we can raise billions more fairly, and fairly means you're not going to have to pay any more, because we can spend all that money and we can raise it all from the rich and stocks and shares. And that is, I think that has a kind of a major credibility problem for the left party. And the danger is voters think, oh my God, how much more are we going to pay? Part of the reason why we went, in 2001, we raised national insurance, we increased tax credits, and we extended the ceiling right up the income range. We said everybody is going to make a contribution to a better national health service, but those who are richer should pay more. And I think one of the problems of the Corbyn years is that Labour sounded like it could deliver fairness without people on middle incomes or on low incomes bearing any burden. And I think that's actually just not electorally credible. And so finding ways in which you can show we're all in it and we all make a contribution, but those who can pay more should pay more. Personally, I think that is much more likely to take you to an electorally credible fairness strategy than giving the appearance that somehow for most people it's a free lunch, because I don't think that works. Yeah. That's all I was saying. Now, I don't find that depressing. I just think that's realpolitik, because actually it's not what you say, it's what people hear when you say things. And the whole thing about politics is to understand not just what you think you mean, but what they hear when you say it. And that's really where sort of trust comes from. And so I don't think of that as being depressing. I just think of it as being, politics.
But I'm going to hold it because there are a number of people I'd like to hear who are joining on the screen. Sally Young actually touched on the same point about fairness, and I'd love to hear from Sally. Matt Dancona is actually making a point about credibility, and I know that Matt's joining us too, and Susie Laxton. Sally Young, do you want to weigh in first if you're there?
I am here from actually quite a nice day in Newcastle today. I think the fairness point is a good point, and it's well made. And I think what you can also say is, what is fair? And I know the terms tax the rich don't go very fair, but we tax the wealthiest, we tax those who can afford to pay, and we certainly tax the tech companies and those who've made a fortune out of the pandemic. But I think we can also talk about what's not fair, and what's absolutely not fair is the cut we're going to have in working tax credit on universal benefits as universal credit this week. Even in the North East, it's going to take over £5 million a week out of the North East economy, as well as the individual poverty. So to try and go back to the food and politics, there's also those who can afford food as well. So yeah. I don't want to lose that aspect of it. If you look at something like food as almost like an analogy, who can afford the food, who can afford the £5 sourdough loaves, and who has to go for 25 pence, old stuff from Greggs. So I think that there are things there about fairness which are important, but also trying to relate it to the food. And this £20 a week cut is not fair, and we're just losing a lot of the movement on that one.
I think the politics of what you just said there is really strong and very powerful. And if you look at what's happened in Germany, what's happened in kind of Scandinavia, if you think about what Labour has to do, kind of standing up for people who are being hard pressed because of their wages and because of their bills, that's exactly where Labour should be. And the things I can say, these kind of things nowadays, I would be amazed if the Conservatives see through this universal credit cut. I think the politics of this for them is really dangerous. As you said, it cuts right across the whole kind of levelling up red wall strategy for the Conservatives. You've had pretty much every Conservative Secretary of State for work and pensions, saying it's the wrong thing to do at the wrong time. I think it goes to the heart of the tension we're going to see between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And I think if it was me, if I was thinking to myself about the politics I would go after at this conference as a Labour figure, I would be less focused on make the rich pay as my main message, not because, I don't think the rich should pay more. I don't think that is necessarily, I think it's an easy message for Labour, but I think it's complicated what people hear. Whereas the fact that Labour would, says that this cut to the incomes of working people now is wrong and should be reversed, that's really powerful. And if I look at the Labour conference in the last few days and think, what do I wish? I wish on energy prices, on fuel, and on universal credit, that had been a stronger part of the messaging. Because I think actually getting into the fairness argument in a way which directly impacts upon the lives of people who you need to persuade, Labour's on your side, there's potency there. My worry is those same people who are told, don't worry, it will all be paid for by international fat cats. I think
people don't buy it.
I think you have to be very careful that they don't buy it, and actually they think.
I just want to hear from Matt D'Ancona, and I want to hear from Susie Laxton, if I might. Matt, what do you take of? Because there is a point, if you listen to Keir Starmer's speech today, which was, in the end, for all the argument that it had inside the room with Labour, how much do you think it really connects with people?
Oh, it's barely a start. And I mean, one has to be realistic that, the bar was set very low in the sense that the conference was pretty much a shambles, and he managed to pull the car out the ditch, but I wouldn't say much more than that. I mean, I think what's really interesting is what Ed said, which I totally agree with, is that it's way too early to assume, as some do on both sides of the Atlantic, that there's a new settled paradigm on spending. There's been a lot of spending because of COVID, and there is broadly speaking, a sort of slight relaxation of approach to borrowing. But I don't think that we can assume from that there's a kind of public consensus on that point. I think what's really interesting from the centre-left point of view is what's the task now? Because the task in '97, which Ed was so intimately involved with, was basically how can we persuade the public that you can bring social justice and economic efficiency together? And that involved reassuring business. It involved making it clear that Labour was in favour of aspiration and enterprise, that it wasn't a party of, prodigal tax and spend. I remember Ed saying, it's prudence with a purpose. But that's a long time ago. It's a quarter of a century ago. And I think, the landscape now is very different. And the task for a centre-left party is very different. And 2021 is not just about reassuring business. You've got an electorate, of course, that needs to be made to trust Labour again, but also has faced a whole series of shocks, from the crash, Brexit, COVID, the impact of technology, and it feels precarious, and is looking for a centre-left government that offers security and resilience and some sort of hope in this whole intergenerational question of justice that we've been talking about. So I sort of wonder whether the old fixation with aspiration is less important than the idea of a fair shake. Having a fair shake and having a government that provides some sort of strategy on issues like climate, on issues like labour mobility, on issues like what sort of country Britain is going to be post Brexit, what sort of resilience it's building in for the impact of technology and future pandemics. It's not totally different to what '97 was all about, but it is different.
Mm-hmm. Ed?
Well, I read Matt, your Tortoise column where you said that the burden for Keir is as much kind of people suggesting he just reruns the New Labour playbook as the Corbyn playbook, and I very much agree with that. And we are in a kind of different time, and that is there are a number of things Keir said in his speech which kind of point to that difference. But I think, and I'm not suggesting that the old tax and spend trust arguments necessarily carry across, but I feel more optimistic about the speech today. But I agree with you that it's an early stage. But it was important for Keir to deliver messages to the party today as well as to the country. It was important to do both. The key thing you have to do as an opposition leader, in my personal view, is you have to open people's ears and make them nod before they listen to the things you say are going to solve problems. You have to say things in a way which people think that makes sense. And I think that's been harder for Keir in the last year and a half because of the pandemic. But sometimes I'd be frustrated he's not done that as much as I would like him to do. But he needs to capture a sense of the common sense. But he partly does that by pushing away things which aren't common sense. And I think two examples of that in the speech. I think the thing he said about NATO in the speech is very important because I think that pushes away a lot of the sort of the marginal seat worries about security, which had built up over the previous leadership. I think that what he said about Brexit, which actually was aimed more at the party than at the country, is also very important because if Labour looks like it's refighting 2016, I think that's catastrophic.
Yeah.
But the party doesn't want to hear that, or parts of the party don't want to hear that. And I think that the country needs to hear him saying those things to the party and nod, and then hear what is he going to do about it. But I think that was an ear-opening moment, and I think the reality is that the heckling is hugely helpful because if he's being heckled by those guys,
the heckling
then people think, okay, well in that case,
he's standing up.
Been heckled by them. Maybe I should listen. And actually, part of the leader of the opposition's task is to just make people nod and say, well, actually, I should listen to this guy now.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Hi, Jess Moore. Hi. This is going to come out as a question, but I'm going to try and segue it back to food or at least a restaurant, though I can't remember what I was eating at the time. I too have now left my old job and I'm a writer, Ed, but back in the day we met very briefly when you came to talk to my old bosses in Stock in Manchester, I think Labour Party conference in 2009 or 10, and they were the then chairs of the Co-op Group and Bank. And I wonder when now in the context of talking about nationalisation in energy firms and rail firms, whether you think the cooperative model has a role to play rather than us talking about nationalisation. I genuinely don't remember what I was eating. It probably was fish, and you very graciously came to say hello to us after presumably your second dinner.
I mean, at the time I was Education Secretary, and one of the great successes has been the cooperative movement in schools. And actually one of the kind of great tragedies at the early Go period was the extent to which they attempted to rip that up and make it a competition between schools. Yeah. And actually cooperation between schools to improve and to support, but also to offer curriculum. And I've seen how, despite the whole of the last 11 years, the cooperative movement has continued to champion that and has continued to grow. I'm not sure that we're going to kind of quickly get to a cooperative solution to the energy companies, but I think schools really works.
And I said I want to hear from Susie Laxton, who's here. Susie, you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, hello.
Thanks for inviting me in. It's really kind. And Ed, thank you. Nice to meet you. You've said quite a lot of things that have prompted lots of thoughts, so I'll try and be concise in what I have to say now.
Good or bad thoughts?
No, lots of good, interesting, curious thoughts, and several I agree thoughts, so even better. I
thought you might be a heckler.
Do you know, I'm a terrible heckler, so I'm not even going to attempt it. I think the comment that I made in the chat that's probably been picked up was around the point you were making about how extra spending doesn't necessarily lead to greater equality and could actually do the opposite. And from my kind of total non-economic background, I currently believe that's really where we're at, because obviously the ONS released the stats a couple of months ago showing that the kind of national debt is at an all-time record high. And it was kind of reported as being due to COVID spending. But if you look at the track over time from where kind of the financial crisis was and we got the coalition government to now, it's been on a rapid kind of trajectory up. So it's like over doubled. And obviously in that time, I think it's fair to say that inequality has also grown. You know, we have poverty kind of at an all-time high. The austerity measures really affected everyone. So I think then the other point of this is me thinking, well, if that's the reality, that we have a Conservative government who are meant to be the whole, you know, we don't spend, we don't tax, we, you know, don't waste your money. It feels to me that Labour or any other party don't necessarily need to come out and put up an argument of a spending plan that is necessarily fair. I wondered if, and I think you were saying this about perception, is whether they need to come up with a narrative that actually explains that no one got helped. Well, that's a bit OTT, but fewer people got help in the last decade, but spending went up. Where did it go? Because I think Labour needs to counter that narrative that they're the party of big spenders. And I think, as you also mentioned, that obviously Jeremy Corbyn sort of faced that when he tried to mention the higher tax rate for those earning over 85,000.
Susie, I mean, there's a lot there, so I'm going to ask Ed to.
So, well, I think the way money's spent and kind of the fairness of its impact and the competence, but also the purpose and the fairness is a rich theme for Labour. And I think, you know, saying Boris Johnson is really a low tax, low spend Tory in disguise doesn't feel very credible to me at the moment, given the government he's presiding over and what they've done in the last year and a half and in this year and in the last two budgets. But looking at where the money's spent and who benefits and how effective they are at spending is I think does have a lot of potency. I've just spent the last 4 months working in social care. I've been working in care homes in Scarborough and in the Northwest for a BBC documentary which is on the next month or so, and it's sort of immersive from the inside. And the government's just announced quite a big spending package, taxation and social care spending. Most of the money in the next few years goes to National Health Service. A small amount of it goes to social care. And we don't know the details yet, but it looks like a sizable proportion of the social care spend will go on funding the cap to stop people facing astronomical care burdens. Now, personally, I think from a fairness point of view, I like this cap because it's so unfair if you are the 1 in 10 families who happen to face an unexpected, catastrophic care challenge, long-term dementia, which ends up with you spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds and seeing, you know, all the savings in your family wiped out. And that feels unfair. It's like chance. It's like it's doing badly in a lottery. And when you think about whether you get cancer or whether you get heart disease or whether you get dementia, surely what we ought to be doing is thinking about how we insure those risks as a collective, as a society. And you can't do that through private insurance. And that's what this cap does. It basically says nobody's going to pay a catastrophic amount of money. So I like it in itself, but if that is what the social care spend is from this package, it will disproportionately benefit a small number of people with higher wealth, particularly in the southern parts of the country. I'm not sure whether that seems fair. I'm not sure whether that's the best quality of spend. It's an increase in spending, but is it going to be effective? If I was Labour, I would be, and I'm sure they will, and I think if you're Boris Johnson, you'd be doing the same. You'd be interrogating, how's this actually going to work through this extra money for social care? So the point of saying that is they could spend more, and it could be simultaneously fair and actually really quite unfair. If that's all there is, it's not going to stop people being paid just over £9 an hour to do incredibly difficult jobs. So, I think there is a way to interrogate, even in a period of rising spending, from a sort of competence and fairness point of view. And that's what I would be doing I think that is what Labour will do.
And I realise we're just coming to the end of the hour. In fact, we've just gone over by 2 minutes. We had a conversation this morning in the newsroom. Yeah, it's gone incredibly fast. But we had a conversation this morning.
I've not told you about my souffle recipe.
By the way, there are a number of things here. There's the Vietnamese pho. I don't know how you pronounce it, but there's that. And there's also the goose with prunes that we haven't talked about.
There's lots in there.
We haven't talked about it. And we haven't talked about the roast beef, but something tells me you're going to get lots of opportunity to talk about the roast beef. But I just want to ask one thing. We had a conversation this morning where we were talking about the book starts with you losing your seat. Roast beef the night before you lose your seat, get the whole team together, cook roast beef, and then sort of your life takes a turn. And then obviously as you read the book, you can't help thinking, God, actually, it must have been traumatic, but also liberating. How much fun all these BBC programmes and Strictly and books and things. But the question we had this morning is whether or not you can have a second act in British politics, whether our system in any way allows someone like you to say, look, I've done this bunch of things, and actually I'm ready to go back, and I'm keen to go back. And putting aside all of the awkwardness of that question, is it actually feasible in the British system to leave Parliament, have a life, and then go back?
It's happened really quite rarely. People have left Parliament to go and do other things. In a way, that's what Boris Johnson did, going to be Mayor of London. It's what maybe Andy Burnham or Sadiq Khan or Dan Jarvis or Tracy Brabin may be thinking of. But stepping outside politics is much less common. And that makes us quite different from America. And that's partly because the party system is so important within our politics, and once you step kind of outside of that, it's harder. I mean, the truth is, I've not spent my time here thinking, what should I say in case I might want to have some political career in the future? I might have said things quite differently if I had. But in a way, the liberation of not having to think like that is so good.
So let me ask you directly: would you go back?
I think being in government was definitely the hardest thing I ever did, and definitely the best thing I ever did. And when we were in government for 13 years, and we did loads of good things, and we made lots of mistakes, and my generation was quite young, and how much better it would have been if we'd, could have had a 13-year apprenticeship, and then 5 years off, and then 13 years in government. But that isn't always how the way things work out.
But just listening to you give that answer, that makes me think you would.
No, I don't miss being in opposition. I don't particularly miss being in Parliament. I've been finding different ways to, I'm hoping that we'll say important things about social care, which will be watched by millions of people who wouldn't necessarily watch a political programme or a speech, but might say, I now see something about the future of care in our society, which I didn't get before. So you look to find different ways of making a contribution. What I've not wanted to do is do kind of politics like in a sort of slightly second order or by halves. I didn't want to go and be sort of, somebody who was being a commentator, popping up on the Today programme or the whole time. And I remember Michael Portillo saying to me, he rang me 2 days after the election in 2015 and said, would you like to make a panorama with me on losing? And I said, no, I really don't want to do that. It seems like a really, really bad idea. But then I saw him with Andrew Neil on the Andrew Neil programme about 18 months later. And because, of course, Michael Portillo went back when he lost in 97. He fought a by-election, became Shadow Chancellor, ran for the leadership. And he said it was the biggest mistake I ever made. Because I went back to try and set the record straight, to prove people they were wrong. And when I got back in there, I didn't know why I was there, and he ended up leaving. And I think probably, I have always wanted to feel proud of what I was part of and acknowledge that it was the best thing I ever did, and not think I want to kind of try and go and kind of make the past good, or I don't want to be a retread. So the answer to your question is, if there was a way to do something which was really about the future and the next stage, fine. But I haven't felt that was what I or the party or the country would cope with me. So instead, I've gone off and made souffles.
Well, listen, it is a great pleasure. Please come back to our newsroom. When you do, please bring this, the treacle tart, because the recipe looks amazing.
It's really good.
Is it very good?
It's really good.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Ed Balls.